Welcome back to another episode of CMO Designs. Today I'm going to show you every step of making this awesome custom mantle. And it's even cooler just because the log I'm using came from the client's house, which was cut when they had it built, so makes it a little more special. To start it off, I invested in a basic chainsaw mill and spent a few hours figuring out how to get everything lined up and completely level on every axis. A lot harder than it seems. I've got a ladder here in between two sawhorses, which the sawmill runs along. And you definitely want to make sure you have a powerful chainsaw, fresh blade, because it can really take its toll on the saw and the person trying to hold all that force steady. You want to make sure to keep it as smooth of transition as possible with little to no stopping in between, because it will leave extra saw marks where you start and stop. I would highly suggest building yourself a nice sturdy work table too, because I regretted committing to using the one I used, but I still made it work. After getting the first cut done, I had to dismantle and reposition everything, and each time you do that, it can take a while getting everything set back into proper position. I ended up adding screws through the bottom of the table into the log to help it remain more steady, and since I was cutting that part away, it wasn't really a problem. After lowering the sawmill and getting it perfectly lined up, I just repeated the cutting process. And you also want to make sure you cut all the way through to the end and not just stop and end up pinching your blade right at the end there. I couldn't put those bottom screws in anymore, so I had to come up with a new way to stabilize it, and I used some basic 90-degree shelf brackets. I didn't bother filming the same cutting process on the third round, but I did for the final here, and I ended up having to put my foot on it for added support to keep it from shaking. I guess my blade must have taken a dive. I also realized I needed to relocate where I put the shelf brackets, one on each side of the ends rather than the middle. And now I can show you how I finished this square one up, but I learned way too late that there were lots of great mantle styles out there other than just square. And I mentioned that to the client and we both agreed on a more natural look, so ended up starting fresh. And now when you got a new log and you're trying to figure out where you want to cut and like what parts to keep, what parts to get rid of, it's really hard to decide. So even after I thought I had it, I decided on a better route, so that's why there's two sets of lines there. There was also the issue of how to prop it up properly since the bottom is so uneven. I eventually came up with the idea of using an old tree ladder for hunting and got everything lined up and level again, then repeated the cutting process. I only needed 2 cuts this time, not so bad. With my cuts over with, I began trying to sand and shape the whole piece with an array of different tools. First is the 60 grit sanding disc, which I realized after a while was just not heavy duty enough. So then I broke out my cut saw Rockler Extreme Spear bit. After removing a lot of decayed wood or parts I just didn't like, I went on to using my trusty flap disc with 100 grit and went over the whole thing.
Should be played at high volume, preferably in a residential area.
Next I used a cut saw shaping disc and more of my flap disc to keep trimming it to my liking, and I ended up wasting several hours just trying to properly shape this one part sticking out here, but it just kept looking too bulbous to me, and I ended up just eventually removing the whole chunk. Now, I don't get to use this big boy very often, so I thought it would make sanding the top a nice smooth finish go a lot quicker. But I ended up just switching to the shaping disc to get rid of more of the really coarse parts first. Then I went on to use an orbital sander with 100 grit, and after that was taking forever, I decided to use my flap disc at the same time. And that really was a game changer. It does take some skill though, like if you were to try to do it yourself, you just got to keep that flap disc moving pretty steady because it can take a good chunk away really fast if you're not careful. After getting all that done, I moved on to thorough sanding with regular sandpaper at 100 grit and then 200 grit to get it nice and smooth and ready to seal. And before I could seal it, I used my drill brush and got rid of any extra debris. Then I moved on to adding an anti-cracking protectant called Seal Once by Marine. It's a great product. I use it on lots of my projects. I let that dry, then came back with some light sanding and added another coat. I did 3 total, then moved on to the gloss finish, and though I did pull it off and got it looking great in the end, I really would not recommend using this finish. Maybe it's just me, but it's just way too hard to get a nice smooth finish, and then it can take several days to fully cure, or the slightest indention will leave an imprint in the finish, so I ended up refinishing this thing over 10 times before I got it right. This stuff is just really watery and will run easily if you add too much.
This should be played at high volume, preferably in a residential area.
And you have to make sure to do the strokes all the way through in the end, or it will leave start and stopping marks in the finish. So at this point I was potentially done, but we were leaving it up in the air to see if we would like it nice and thick as it is, or to make a third cut at the bottom and trim it down a few inches. So got everything set back up, took off a few inches, and with the final cut completed, I repeated the sanding and sealing process over again. And I also did it on the piece I cut off since I wanted to use it as a nice floating shelf. Not a bad idea. Now it was time to drill my holes, and I started with a chalk line. And I did a small hole first and worked my way up to help prevent against extra cracking. I actually spent a lot of time trying to make sure everything would line up properly, like where to put the holes and whatnot, and it all has to be perfectly level. There's just so many aspects you want to make sure to get right. It's important to make sure you drill as perpendicular as possible so your bolts end up at a nice perfect 90-degree angle. With everything good to go, it was time to drill my holes in the brick, and I started off with my electric drill while using a little vacuum to help suck the dust as I went, but I had to switch to a power drill because that brick was just no joke. After cleaning the holes and making sure they were 3 inches deep and 3/4 wide, I went ahead and put the lag shields in and screwed the 5/8 lag bolts until it was nice and snug. They widen as you screw it in, creating a very solid locked-in connection. And with all 3 lag bolts secured, I used my Sawzall to cut off the excess. And decided to leave this last little bit hanging just to annoy my fellow OCD peeps out there. Now it was time to hang it, and shout out to Sebastian, who just happened to be a guest at the house visiting, cause I probably couldn't have done it on my own, especially since we struggled at first and had to set it back down. I decided to widen the beginning part of the holes a little bit, and I realized I should have sanded those sharp edges on the bolts after the cuts, because that was what kept catching on the wood, preventing it from sliding on. I didn't get footage of it, but I used my Sawzall blade to carefully round off those edges, and after that it actually just went right on, though it did take a few bangs with a rubber mallet. I also didn't get footage on the back side, but I coated it with construction grade adhesives so that it added a little extra security as it cured to the wall. Other than that, it was time to admire a job well done, and I felt super happy with the turnout, and so did the clients. I also want to give an extra thanks to Eliu and Steph for giving me this opportunity and trusting me to pull it off, and also thanks because they bought this piece from me as well last year. So yeah, you guys are awesome. Really appreciate you. Alright y'all, well, hope you enjoyed this video, and be sure to let me know what you think. Likes, comments, and shares help me tremendously, so do your thing and I'll keep doing mine. Alright y'all, I'm on to the next one. Hope you are too. See you next time.